of Claremont. I'm the Acadian therapist, and this week I'm going to discuss, at last, the Acadians. However, I'm also going to talk about intergenerational trauma and epigenetics and how understanding these concepts can help lead to an improved quality of life for yourself, perhaps also for future generations. So I hope you'll stick with me. As always, if you see value in this content, please feel free to like, subscribe, share, comment. All these things help support my work here. So let's get right to it. My last name is Claremont, or Clermont. This marks me as one of the descendants of the original Acadians, extending back to the mid-1700s. Actually, probably earlier. I'm a bit rusty on the specific details. And I'm coming to you from Grand Pré, which is a beautiful area in Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia. Very fertile farmlands. To this day, as you drive through the valley, you will see so many farms and just gorgeous expanses of green. And so this was very appealing to my ancestors, some of the original French settlers who would become the Acadians. They were not a very well educated population. Many of them were not literate. In fact, for the most part, the only educated person or literate person in the community would be the priest. And so this became the de facto leader of many of these communities. To this day, from Cheticamp to Clare to my neck of the woods in southwestern Nova Scotia, there remain a lot of churches, less than there used to be, and certainly less practicing Catholics than there were back in the day. However, this was essentially the culture. They were hard workers, they were very religious folk, and had very good relations, this is my understanding, with the Mi'kmaq, who were the indigenous peoples at the time. Sort of marked them unusually relative to many other colonizing communities. Now, I was taught that the British were the bad guys, as in the British Crown, for the tragedy that would befall the Acadians. However, it turns out, at least the current education, is that the governor of Nova Scotia at the time, British, was not very comfortable with all of these folks of French descent. Even though the Acadians were not really subjects of France, there was a lot of tension between England and France. What followed was the death of thousands and the roundup of the Acadians and the deportation of the Acadians. They were sent out essentially around the world. A significant number were sent to Louisiana, where they remained the Cajuns, and were scattered around the Maritimes as well. Some of the Mi'kmaq hid the Acadians. Some of the Acadians changed their last names to fit in. So, for example, there's a number of Clements in Nova Scotia, which some are actually Claremonts, descended, they would be cousins of mine. And so this was a very dark time, a very tragic time for my people. Immortalized in, I believe it's Longfellow's poem, Evangeline. In fact, that's the statue behind me. Evangeline and Gabrielle were tragically separated lovers, at least in this story. And it remains a very influential story. In fact, in annual Acadian parades, there are often costumed Evangeline and Gabrielle. And of course, there's so much representation in various Acadian communities of those heroes. And so the British soldiers removed the Acadians, claimed their land, destroyed their communities, their villages. However, the Acadians were eventually allowed to return and were usually resettled on very nutrient-poor lands, certainly not lovely lands like this. And they were usually settled around British colonies. So, for example, I come from an area close to Yarmouth, which is a very English-sounding name, and it's surrounded by a lot of small Acadian communities. The hope was that the Acadian culture would be destroyed by the influence of the nearby British and English. In fact, even in school, I was taught to practice my language and to honor my language because of the risk of assimilation or assimilation. It's important to note that I'm recording this just a few days after Nova Scotia's first Truth and Reconciliation Day, which is a national, actually it's not just in Nova Scotia, it's national, acknowledgement and recognition of the Canadian government's attempted, and I would say ongoing, genocidal efforts towards the Indigenous populations of Canada. A similar strategy was employed with the residential schools, an effort to destroy Indigenous cultures and language. In fact, it's my hope that with the historic good relations between the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq, recently there have been renewed tensions between the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq relating to the fishery. But it's my hope that we can find some memory of our historic good ties and good relationships to be able to work together to help improve together our lot. The reason I'm sharing this story is to talk about intergenerational trauma. So these influences from the past, knowing these parts of my story, helps me understand important parts of my identity. And in fact, science is catching up to this. When I was in school, we used to talk a lot about nature versus nurture. Perhaps they still do. And essentially what this refers to is, to what extent is human behavior and human psychology shaped by nature or genetics, and to what extent is it shaped by nurture or the way that you were raised? And of course, there remain scads of parenting books, and that the advice on proper parenting is always changing. More recently, science has been talking more about epigenetics, or the relationship between genetics and nurture and environment. And so essentially the environment that you're in or that your parents are in will determine to what extent certain genes are activated or deactivated. And so you have this intergenerational ripple effect of these early influences. Now, we can talk about trauma, and certainly that is relevant, but we can also talk about intergenerational resilience, the unique strengths that people needed in order to survive in new environments. So we are the descendants of all of these generations of ancestors that lived and died and triumphed and suffered. When we understand this, it helps us to understand our identity. When we understand some of the old religious values that perhaps shaped our ancestors, even if we are no longer following the same religions, these help to shape our basic sense of right and wrong, of morals, and of what has value and what does not have value. So when we take the time to understand our history and our culture's history, it helps us to understand ourselves, as well as what historic actions that we can be proud of and what we need to atone for. I know that to this day, there are annual Acadian festivals that are quite dramatic and celebrate our culture. I get very excited when I hear from anyone from Louisiana where they talk about the Cajun culture. It's like talking to distant cousins. We remain connected hundreds of years later in this unusual and powerful way. And of course, there's a need to look forward, especially in this time of climate change, to once again honor Indigenous teachings. When we think about 7 generations hence, how do we help create the world that our progeny can be proud of? I'll leave you with those thoughts, friends. Thank you so much for joining me once again. If you would care to like, subscribe, share, comment, it's very much appreciated. In the meantime, we will see you again soon. Take care.